The night everything changed, Maeve was elbow-deep in bread dough, and her daughter was asking why stars don't fall. "They do, baby," Maeve said, pushing the heel of her hand into the dough, feeling it push back. "We just call them something different when they do." Clover, 6 years old and deeply unimpressed by most answers, considered this from her perch on the kitchen counter. "Do they hurt when they land?" "Sometimes." That was 3 years ago. Before the man in the charcoal suit walked into the café. Before Maeve learned that some things fall toward you on purpose. She'd opened groundwork on the corner of Ashfield and 9th with $11,000, a used espresso machine, and a stubbornness her late mother used to call a gift, and her ex-husband called a disease. The café had been a florist's before. The walls still smelled faintly of something green and alive. Even after 2 coats of paint, even in January, Maeve kept it. She kept the smell, kept the mismatched chairs, kept the chalkboard above the counter, where she wrote a different question every morning instead of a daily special. Things like, "What did you almost say yesterday?" Or, "Is the thing you're waiting for actually coming?" Clover had started kindergarten that fall. Every morning, Maeve dropped her at the yellow door of Ridgewood Elementary, watched her disappear inside without looking back. Because Clover never looked back, had been born facing forward, and then drove the 11 minutes to groundwork, unlocked the door, and became someone who had things under control. She was good at that, the becoming. What she wasn't good at was the space between closing time and sleep, when the cafe was empty and the chairs were up on the tables and she could hear herself think too clearly. On those nights, she'd sit at the counter with a cup of whatever was left in the press and go through her father's notebooks. He'd been a tax attorney, methodical and quiet, but he'd kept these notebooks, leather-covered, elastic-banded, full of observations that had nothing to do with tax law. Small things he'd noticed. The way her mother held a coffee cup with both hands even in summer. The specific gray of Boston Harbor at 6 in the morning. The names of 3 men he said had destroyed someone's life and gotten away with it. He'd died 8 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal. He'd left her the notebooks in an envelope marked for Maeve, "When you're ready." She still wasn't sure she was ready, but she kept reading. The man came in on a Tuesday in March. She noticed him the way you notice weather. Before you consciously register it, something in your body already knows. He was tall, somewhere in his early 40s, wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly rent in a way that wasn't showy, just matter of fact. He had dark hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had opinions. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the chalkboard. That morning's question. "What are you pretending not to know?" Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't have named what. He ordered a black coffee, sat at the table in the corner, the one with the uneven leg she kept meaning to fix, and opened a laptop. He didn't look up again for 2 hours. He tipped 40% and left without making eye contact. He came back Wednesday, Thursday. By Friday, she'd started making his coffee when she saw him round the corner through the window before he'd even reached the door. He noticed. "You already knew," he said, looking at the cup on the counter. "You're consistent," she said. "Is that good or bad?" She handed him the coffee. "Depends what you're consistent about." His name was Adrian Voss. She didn't know that yet. She learned it when her barista Priya leaned over 2 weeks later and said quietly, "Maeve, do you know who that is?" She didn't. Priya showed her on her phone. The article was from a financial publication, 6 months old. Voss Capital. Acquires third harbor development in 8 months. The photo was him, slightly younger, shaking hands with someone in front of a building that looked like it cost more than some countries. The caption said, "Adrian Voss, CEO, described by rivals as the most patient predator in the room." Maeve looked at the photo for a moment. Then she looked at the man in the corner, who was eating a blueberry scone and reading something on his laptop with the same focused calm he brought to everything. "Huh," she said. "He's not just rich," Priya said. My cousin works in finance downtown. She says his name comes up in things. Not good things? What kind of things?" Priya lowered her voice. "Connected things." Maeve handed back the phone. She went to check on the pour-over station. She told herself it didn't matter. People who came to her cafe were just people at her cafe. She'd served a city councilman who'd been indicted 2 months later. She'd served a woman who cried every morning for a year and then one day came in glowing and said she'd left her husband. She didn't ask questions. It wasn't her business. She told herself that. He asked her to dinner on a Thursday in April. She said no. He came back Friday, didn't mention it, drank his coffee, left. She appreciated that. Most men, when they asked and got turned down, either got weird or tried again with more pressure. Adrian Voss just nodded like he was updating a calculation and moved on. She almost said yes the second time, 6 weeks later, mostly because of what he'd said when he finally asked again. He'd waited until the cafe was nearly empty, late afternoon, golden light coming through the west-facing window and doing unreasonable things to the dust in the air. "I know you don't know me," he said. "I know what you've probably found out about me online is not exactly reassuring. I'm not going to pretend it is. But I'd like to have dinner with you, and I'd like to be honest about who I am, and I think you're someone who would appreciate that more than most people." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very calculated thing to say." "Yes," he said. "I thought about it." She almost smiled. "Saturday," she said. 7 o'clock, and I'm driving myself. I wouldn't expect anything different." She told Priya, who told her she was insane. She arranged for Clover to spend the night at her friend Bia's house. Something Clover accepted with complete indifference because Bia had a trampoline. She wore a dress she'd bought 2 years ago for a wedding and never had occasion to wear again, dark green, and she drove herself to the restaurant he'd named, which was the kind of place that didn't have prices on the menu. He was already there. He stood when she walked in. She'd half expected him to be a different person in that context, bigger, more performative, but he was exactly the same, contained, attentive. He asked about the cafe, asked about what made her want to open it, and then, before she'd finished answering, asked a follow-up question that meant he'd actually listened to the first part. She wasn't used to that. She'd been married to a man who listened to respond. Adrian listened to understand. She didn't mean to tell him about her father. She'd had 1 glass of wine and was explaining why she'd named the cafe Groundwork, and somehow she still didn't fully understand how. She was talking about her father's notebooks, how he'd kept them for 30 years, how she still wasn't through all of them. Adrian went very still. "What kind of notebooks?" he asked. "Observations." He was meticulous about things he noticed. It's random stuff, mostly, but there were some pages at the back. She stopped. "Sorry, this isn't dinner conversation." "It is," he said quietly. "Please." What was in the pages at the back? She looked at him. Something in his attention had changed quality, still focused, but with an edge she hadn't seen before. She made a note of it and filed it away. "Names," she said carefully. People he said had done something. He was vague about what. "I always assumed it was a work thing, a case that went wrong, a client who got hurt." Adrian picked up his water glass, set it back down. "Do you still have them? The notebooks?" "At the cafe," she said. "I keep them in my desk." He nodded. He changed the subject. For the rest of the evening, he was easy and present and funny in a dry, understated way that caught her off guard. When he walked her to her car, he didn't try to kiss her. He said, "Thank you for coming. I know it cost you something." She drove home thinking about that, about the stillness that had come over him, about the question he'd asked with so much care it felt almost like a held breath. She looked up the names from her father's notebook when she got home. It took her until 2 in the morning. The 3 men were all connected to a financial services company that had collapsed 11 years ago, taking the retirement savings of several hundred people with it. One of them was in federal prison. One had died. One was serving on the board of a technology nonprofit in Connecticut and had never been charged with anything. Her father had represented the families who'd lost everything. He'd fought for 4 years. He'd lost. She sat at her kitchen table and looked at the name of the third man, Gerald Whitmore. Then she opened a new browser tab and searched Adrian Voss plus Gerald Whitmore. The first result was a business journal piece from 2 years ago. Voss Capital had made an aggressive move on one of Whitmore's shell companies, a hostile acquisition that had dissolved the company and in the process surfaced several financial irregularities. Whitmore had faced a preliminary inquiry. It hadn't gone anywhere yet. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark kitchen with her cold tea and thought about a man who asked questions like he already knew the answer was going to matter. The first break-in happened 2 weeks later. She came to open groundwork at 6:30 in the morning, and the back door was slightly ajar. She knew she'd locked it. She always locked it. It was the last thing she checked every night, part of a routine as automatic as breathing. She stood on the sidewalk with her keys in her hand and thought through her options, and then called the non-emergency police line and waited across the street until 2 officers arrived and cleared the building. Nothing was taken. The register hadn't been touched. The back office, though, her desk, had been gone through, carefully, methodically. Someone who knew how to search and knew what they were looking for. The notebooks were still there. She hadn't moved them, but they'd been touched. She could tell by the way the elastic band on the third one was twisted the wrong direction. She told the officers it was probably just someone looking for cash. She waited until they left. Then she locked herself in the office and photographed every page of every notebook and emailed them to herself and to a cloud drive, and then she put the actual notebooks in her bag and took them home. She didn't call Adrian. She sat with that choice and turned it over and chose not to. Not yet. He called her 2 days later. Just to talk, he said. She let it be casual. At the end of the call, she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Gerald Whitmore, do you know him?" A pause. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. "Why do you ask?" "My father had his name in the notebooks." Another pause, longer. "Maeve." His voice had changed. "Where are the notebooks right now?" "Safe," she said. "Why?" "I need you to listen to me carefully. Don't keep them anywhere connected to your name. Not your home, not the café. Give them to someone you trust completely, or put them in a safe deposit box under a name that isn't yours, and don't tell anyone you have them." "Who would I tell?" "That's not what worries me," he said. "What worries me is who might already know." She felt something go cold and clear in her chest. "You're going to need to explain that." He did. It took a long time. Gerald Whitmore, Adrian told her, had not been finished by the preliminary inquiry. He'd been insulated. He had connections in 3 different cities. People who moved money and information on his behalf. People who monitored anyone who might have surviving evidence of what he'd done 11 years ago. Her father had been monitored for years. After he died, the monitoring had paused. But when Maeve had mentioned the notebooks at dinner, she'd been overheard by someone at the next table who had no reason to be in that restaurant except as eyes for Whitmore's people. "You knew this," she said. "When I told you about the notebooks at dinner, you already knew part of this. I knew about your father," Adrian said. "I didn't know about the notebooks. Why did you start coming to my cafe?" He was quiet. "Adrian, because I was investigating Whitmore," he said, "and your father's name kept coming up. And then I saw that he had a daughter who'd opened a cafe 3 blocks from an office where one of Whitmore's shell companies is registered. I thought." He stopped. "You thought I might have something useful. I thought you might be in danger without knowing it." "That's also true." She pressed her thumb against the edge of her kitchen table until it hurt. "So the dinner, the questions about the notebooks. I was trying to understand what you had and whether you were at risk." A beat. "And then I got there and you were just, you, Maeve, and it became something else." Both things were true at the same time. "I know that's not what you wanted to hear." She thought about Clover asleep down the hall. She thought about her father in his last months, still meticulous, still watching, still filling the notebooks with what he knew. "You're going to help me use what he left," she said. "It wasn't a question. If you'll let me." "There are conditions. I expected there would be." "Clover comes first," she said. "Before any of this, before whatever you need from me, if I say she needs to come first, you stop. Everything stops." "Yes," he said immediately. "No hesitation. And you don't make decisions for me about any of this. You tell me what you know and I decide." Agreed. She let out a breath. "Okay," she said. "Then tell me everything." She moved the notebooks to a safe deposit box at a credit union across town, registered under her friend Jess's name. Jess was a labor attorney who had the specific quality of not asking questions when you didn't want questions and asking exactly the right ones when you did. Maeve told her only that she needed a favor. Jess said, Does this involve something I should know about as a mandatory reporter? Maeve said no. Jess handed over the key. She told Priya there had been a break-in, and she was updating the security system, which was true. She didn't tell her anything else. She put better locks on the back door, and a camera pointed at the alley, and she kept working. She kept writing questions on the chalkboard. She kept dropping Clover at the yellow door. Adrian sent her information in pieces, documents, records, the kind of thing that required knowing where to look and having the resources to get there. He'd been building a case against Whitmore for 2 years, but what he had was circumstantial. What her father had recorded was something different. The testimony of the people Whitmore had personally promised would be protected. Her father had written down what they told him, word for word, in those careful pages. It was the thread that connected everything else. She photographed the relevant sections. She sent them to a contact Adrian gave her, a journalist at a national publication who had been sitting on the financial irregularities story for months, waiting for the thing that made it whole. It was enough. She didn't know that yet. She didn't know anything would happen. She sat with the uncertainty the way she'd learned to sit with things she couldn't control, and she made coffee and helped Clover with a school project about the water cycle and tried not to think about the camera in the alley. The second break-in didn't happen at the café. It happened at her house. She'd been at Jess's, a rare evening off, a bottle of Côtes du Rhône and 3 hours of not thinking. She came home to find the front door unlocked. She stood on the porch and knew, with complete clarity, that she'd locked it. She went through every possibility in 3 seconds, and then she called Adrian. "Don't go in," he said. He was there in 11 minutes. She'd counted. He brought 2 men she'd never met, large, efficient, and apparently comfortable with the concept of clearing a residential property at 10:30 at night. They found nothing except evidence of a careful search. Her bedroom, the spare room she used as a filing space, the kitchen, everything slightly wrong in ways someone without her attention to detail might not have caught. Clover was at Bia's, again. This time, Maeve was grateful without the complexity. She stood in her kitchen and felt something she hadn't let herself feel since this started, a thin, high current of real fear. Not the intellectual fear of understanding risk, but the physical kind, the kind that knows a body is involved. Adrian came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. He didn't touch her. He knew without being told that she needed the space. "They're escalating," he said quietly. "I know. The journalist has enough to move forward. The publication has legal review. But it could still be weeks." "How many weeks is Clover at Bia's house?" she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. He turned to look at her. "I have a house outside the city. 30 minutes. It's secure. Actually secure, not just the word. If you're willing, I'd like you and Clover to stay there until this is done." She looked at him. "I know what I'm asking," he said. "I know what it costs you. Do you? I know it costs you the version of yourself that doesn't need anyone." He said it carefully, without judgment. "And I'm asking you to set that down for a few weeks, not permanently, just until Clover is safe." She looked away, at the window. At the dark backyard she'd planted tomatoes in last summer that Clover had eaten straight off the vine, standing barefoot in the dirt, making a sound of pure satisfaction. "She doesn't know anything about this," Maeve said. "She won't have to." She pressed her eyes shut. "Open them." "I need to tell her we're having an adventure," she said. "She'll believe that. She likes adventures." Adrian nodded. "What kind of adventure?" "I'll think of something." She reached for her keys. "I need to call Jess." Clover took to the house with the enthusiasm of a child who finds everything interesting. It was an older property, stone and timber, set back from a road in a county Maeve, had driven through exactly once before and never stopped in. There were 3 dogs. Adrian's, apparently. She hadn't known about the dogs, and Clover immediately appointed herself their supervisor. "Their names are wrong," Clover announced on the second day. Adrian looked up from his laptop. "Excuse me? The big one looks like a Franklin, not a Duke. He has Franklin energy." Adrian considered this seriously. "I'll take that under advisement." Clover nodded and went back to supervising. Maeve watched this and felt something unfamiliar move through her. She'd been so careful about the territory between her life and other people's. The cafe was hers. The house was hers. Clover was hers. She'd built a clean geometry of possession, not out of greed, but out of the knowledge that when you depended on shared territory, you had to negotiate its loss. She'd done that once. She'd been 28 and in love and certain and wrong, and the negotiation of the loss had cost her 3 years and a specific kind of hope she'd had to rebuild from different materials. She hadn't let anyone close enough to the geometry since. She sat at the window with her coffee and watched Adrian crouch down to explain something to Clover about the stone walls, pointing at the old mortar, and Clover listening with her chin in her hands, completely absorbed. Adrian was good with her without trying to be. He didn't perform interest. He just had it. She thought, this is dangerous in a way the break-ins aren't. The story broke on a Thursday morning. She was making pancakes. Clover's requirement, non-negotiable. Thursday was always pancakes, when her phone started going. Jess first, then Priya, then a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be the journalist who'd held the story. Whitmore Holdings. A decade of buried evidence, and the family's still waiting for justice. The piece named names. It cited the notebooks, not by her name, not by her father's, but the evidence was specific and sourced, and the publication had clearly spent significant legal capital on it. By noon, there were 2 federal investigators at Gerald Whitmore's Connecticut office. By 3, his nonprofit had released a statement. By 5, a former associate had gone on record. She sat at the stone table in Adrian's kitchen and read every word of the coverage on her phone while Clover watched a movie in the other room with the dogs arranged around her like a very furry honor guard. Adrian came in from wherever he'd been and read her face. "It's enough?" she asked. "It's enough to start," he said. "The full legal process will take time, but yes, enough." She nodded. She felt strangely empty, not disappointed, just hollowed out in the way you get when something you've been bracing for finally lands. She thought about her father in his last months, still keeping the notebooks, still believing someone would use them. She thought about the families whose savings had disappeared. She thought about 4 years of her father's life spent on a case he'd lost. "He would have been so angry," she said, "that it took this long." "Yes," Adrian said. "He would also have been." She stopped, looked at the table. He believed in this stuff. Evidence. Facts. The idea that if you got the right information to the right people, something would actually happen. She pressed her thumb against the table again, the old habit. He died thinking he'd failed. No. She let out a breath. No, he hadn't. They sat with that for a while. It didn't need to be filled. She went home on Saturday. She'd half expected to feel relief, returning to her own kitchen, her own mismatched chairs, the smell of old wood and coffee deep in the walls of the cafe. She did feel those things, but she also felt, with a clarity she wasn't ready to examine, the specific absence of the stone house, the dogs, the way Adrian drank his coffee, standing at the counter like he was thinking about something, and the coffee was incidental. She didn't see him for 2 weeks. He called once. They talked for an hour about something completely unrelated to all of it. She was trying to source a new single origin from a farm in Honduras. He had opinions about supply chain logistics that turned out to be unexpectedly helpful. And somewhere in the middle of an argument about whether direct trade relationships were sustainable, she started laughing at something he said and couldn't stop. "What? He's nothing," she said. You're funny. I keep forgetting that." A pause. "Why do you keep forgetting it?" She thought about that honestly. "Because the first thing I noticed about you was that you were dangerous," she said. "And it's easier to stay careful about people you've filed under dangerous. And now?" She looked out the cafe window at the evening street, people heading home, the light going that deep gold it got in May. "And now I think maybe the filing system needs updating." He came by on a Sunday morning, not to the cafe but to her house. He knocked. That mattered, not because she expected him to walk in, but because the choice to knock said something about who he'd decided to be with her. She opened the door, and Clover appeared at her elbow, immediately suspicious of the disruption to her Sunday, and looked at Adrian with a particular assessment of a 6-year-old who has decided she is in charge of vetting. "Did you rename the big dog yet?" Clover asked. "I did," Adrian said. "His name is Franklin now." Clover considered this with great seriousness. Then she stepped back and said, "Okay," and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Maeve looked at Adrian. He looked at her. "That was the interview," she said. "Did I pass?" She opened the door wider. "Ask me again in a few months," she said. "But you can come in." He came in. The door closed behind him. In the kitchen, something was already on the stove, and outside the window the Sunday was doing what Sundays do. Unhurried, particular, quietly full of the kind of time that takes nothing from you. She didn't need anything to be certain. She'd learned that much from the last few months. Certainty was the wrong thing to ask for. You could have evidence. You could have the right information. You could send it to the people who needed it and trust that something would move. The rest was just showing up in your own kitchen on an ordinary morning and choosing to let someone stay.